The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of the school's main office, casting long shadows across the polished floor. The air was thick with tension, and the faint hum of fluorescent lights only added to the unease. A young student, no older than 16, sat stiffly in a chair outside the principal's office. His dark eyes were fixed on the ground, his hands clenched tightly in his lap. He had been called out of class earlier that morning, and now he waited, unsure of what was coming next. Inside the office, the principal, a stern woman in her late 40s with sharp features and a no-nonsense demeanor, sat behind her desk. Her fingers tapped impatiently on the surface as she glanced at the clock. Across from her stood the teacher who had initiated the situation, a middle-aged man with a receding hairline and a look of frustration etched on his face. He had been teaching at the school for over a decade, and this was the first time he had ever felt the need to escalate a matter to this level. "I'm telling you, this student has been nothing but trouble," the teacher said, his voice rising slightly. "He's disruptive, disrespectful, and today he crossed the line. I can't have him in my class anymore." The principal leaned back in her chair, her expression unreadable. "And you're sure there's no other way to handle this? Suspension, perhaps? Expulsion is a serious step." The teacher shook his head firmly. "I've tried everything. Detentions, parent meetings, even extra assignments to keep him busy. Nothing works. He's a distraction to the other students, and I can't teach with him in the room." The principal sighed, rubbing her temples. She had heard similar complaints before, but something about this case felt different. Still, she trusted her staff, and if the teacher was adamant, she had to take his word for it. "All right," she said finally. "Bring him in." The student was ushered into the office, his shoulders hunched as if trying to make himself smaller. He avoided eye contact with both adults, his gaze fixed on the floor. The principal studied him for a moment before speaking. "Do you know why you're here?" The boy nodded slightly but said nothing. His silence only seemed to irritate the teacher further. "See? This is exactly what I'm talking about. He refuses to engage, refuses to take responsibility for his actions." The principal held up a hand to silence the teacher. "Let's hear his side of the story first." She turned to the student, her tone softening just a fraction. "What happened today?" The boy hesitated, his lips parting as if he wanted to speak, but no words came out. The teacher let out an exasperated sigh. "He was arguing with another student, disrupting the entire class. When I asked him to stop, he became defiant. I had no choice but to send him to the office." The principal's eyes narrowed as she looked back at the student. "Is that true?" The boy finally looked up, his eyes filled with a mix of anger and hurt. "I wasn't arguing," he said quietly. "I was trying to explain something, but he wouldn't listen. He never listens." The teacher's face flushed with anger. "That's not the point. You were out of line, and you know it." The principal held up her hand again, silencing the teacher once more. She turned back to the student, her expression thoughtful. "Is there anything else you'd like to say?" The boy shook his head, his shoulders slumping in defeat. He knew it didn't matter what he said. The decision had already been made. The principal leaned forward, her hands clasped on the desk. "I'm sorry, but based on what I've heard, I have no choice but to expel you. You'll need to gather your things and leave the premises immediately." The boy's eyes widened in shock, but he said nothing. He simply nodded, his face a mask of resignation. He turned and walked out of the office, his footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. As he made his way to his locker, the boy's mind raced. He knew his father would be furious, but he also knew there was nothing he could do to change what had happened. He grabbed his backpack and stuffed his belongings inside, his hands trembling slightly. He was about to close the locker when he heard a familiar voice behind him. "What's going on?" The boy turned to see his best friend standing there, a look of concern on his face. I got expelled, he said simply, his voice barely above a whisper. His friend's eyes widened in shock. What? Why? The boy shrugged, his shoulders heavy with the weight of the situation. Doesn't matter. They already made up their minds. His friend opened his mouth to say something, but before he could, the sound of a car pulling up outside caught their attention. The boy's heart sank as he recognized the sleek black SUV that had just parked in front of the school. His father had arrived. The boy took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. He knew his father wouldn't take this lightly, and he also knew that once his father got involved, things were about to get a lot more complicated. As he walked toward the front entrance, the boy couldn't help but feel a sense of dread building in the pit of his stomach. He had no idea what was going to happen next, but he knew one thing for sure: his life was about to change in ways he couldn't even begin to imagine. The boy stepped out of the school building, the cool breeze brushing against his face as he approached the black SUV parked near the entrance. The tinted windows made it impossible to see inside, but he didn't need to. He could feel his father's presence even before the door opened. The engine was still running, a low hum that matched the tension in the air. The driver's side door swung open, and his father stepped out. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man with an air of authority that seemed to command attention wherever he went. His sharp eyes immediately locked onto his son, and the boy could see the questions brewing behind them. Without a word, his father walked around the vehicle and opened the passenger door, gesturing for his son to get in. The boy hesitated for a moment, his feet feeling like they were rooted to the ground. He knew what was coming: the questions, the disappointment, the inevitable lecture. But there was no avoiding it. He climbed into the SUV, his backpack clutched tightly in his hands. The door closed with a soft thud, and his father got back into the driver's seat. For a few moments, there was silence, the only sound the faint ticking of the engine cooling down. Then his father spoke, his voice calm but firm. What happened? The boy stared straight ahead, his fingers fidgeting with the strap of his backpack. I got expelled, he said quietly, his voice barely audible. His father's jaw tightened, but he didn't say anything right away. Instead, he started the car and pulled away from the school, the tires crunching against the gravel. The boy could feel the weight of his father's gaze, even as he kept his eyes fixed on the road ahead. Start from the beginning, his father said after a long pause. And don't leave anything out. The boy took a deep breath, his mind racing as he tried to figure out how to explain what had happened. He knew his father wouldn't accept excuses, but he also knew he had to tell the truth. I wasn't trying to cause trouble, he began, his voice shaky. There was this kid in class who kept saying stuff, and I couldn't let it slide. So I said something back. The teacher didn't like it, and he sent me to the office. Next thing I know, they're telling me I'm expelled. His father's grip on the steering wheel tightened, his knuckles turning white. What did you say? The boy hesitated, his stomach churning as he recalled the argument. It wasn't anything bad, he said quickly. I stood up for myself. That's all. His father let out a slow breath, his expression unreadable. And that's why they expelled you? For standing up for yourself? The boy nodded, his throat tightening. They said I was being disruptive. That I was disrespectful. But I wasn't trying to be. I didn't want to let him get away with it. His father was silent for a long time, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. The boy could feel the tension in the air, thick and heavy, and he braced himself for the storm he knew was coming. But instead of yelling, his father simply shook his head, his voice low and measured. You know better than to let someone else's words get to you. You're smarter than that. The boy's shoulders slumped, his chest tightening with a mix of guilt and frustration. I know, he said quietly. But it's not fair. They never listen to me. They just assume I'm the problem. His father glanced at him, his expression softening just a fraction. "Life isn't always fair," he said. "But that doesn't mean you let it break you. You have to be better than that. Stronger." The boy didn't respond, his mind swirling with emotions he couldn't quite put into words. He knew his father was right, but that didn't make it any easier to accept. He felt like he was stuck in a never-ending cycle, constantly fighting against a system that seemed determined to push him down. As they drove through the quiet streets, the boy couldn't help but wonder what would happen next. He had no idea where they were going or what his father had planned, but he knew one thing for sure: this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Finally, his father pulled into the parking lot of a small, unassuming building. The sign out front read, "Community Center," and the boy frowned, confused. "Why are we here?" he asked. His father turned off the engine and unbuckled his seatbelt, his expression serious. "Because we're going to fix this," he said simply. "But first, you need to understand something. What happened today isn't just about you. It's about something bigger. And if you want to change it, you're going to have to fight for it." The boy stared at his father, his heart pounding in his chest. He had no idea what his father meant, but he could sense the determination in his voice. Whatever was about to happen, he knew it was going to change everything. As they stepped out of the car and walked toward the building, the boy couldn't shake the feeling that he was standing on the edge of something much bigger than himself. And for the first time in a long time, he felt a spark of hope. The community center was quiet, its halls empty except for the faint echo of their footsteps as the boy and his father walked inside. The building was modest, with worn carpets and walls lined with flyers advertising local events and programs. The boy had never been here before, and he couldn't help but feel a little out of place. He glanced at his father, who seemed to know exactly where he was going, his steps purposeful and confident. They stopped in front of a door with a small plaque that read, "Youth Advocacy Office." His father knocked twice before pushing the door open, revealing a small room filled with books, papers, and a desk cluttered with files. Behind the desk sat a woman in her early 30s, her dark hair pulled back into a neat bun. She looked up as they entered, her eyes lighting up with recognition. "Mr. Johnson," she said, standing up and extending her hand. "It's good to see you again." The boy's father shook her hand firmly, a small smile playing on his lips. "Good to see you too, Ms. Carter. This is my son." Ms. Carter turned her attention to the boy, her expression warm but serious. "I've heard a lot about you," she said. "Why don't you have a seat?" The boy hesitated for a moment before sitting down in one of the chairs across from her desk. His father remained standing, his arms crossed over his chest as he leaned against the wall. The boy could feel his father's eyes on him, but he kept his gaze fixed on Ms. Carter, unsure of what to expect. "So," Ms. Carter began, folding her hands on the desk. "Your father tells me you've had a rough day. Want to tell me what happened?" The boy glanced at his father, who gave him a small nod of encouragement. Taking a deep breath, he began to explain the events of the day, his voice shaky at first but growing steadier as he went on. He told her about the argument in class, the teacher's reaction, and the principal's decision to expel him. As he spoke, Miss Carter listened intently, her expression thoughtful. When he finished, she leaned back in her chair, her eyes narrowing slightly. "And you're sure there's nothing else? No other incidents that might have led to this?" The boy shook his head. "No, ma'am. I mean, I've had detention before, but nothing like this. I wasn't trying to cause trouble." Ms. Carter nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. "I believe you," she said finally. "But the school might not see it that way. They have their own version of events, and they're not always willing to listen to the student's side of the story." The boy's heart sank, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "So there's nothing I can do?" Ms. Carter's eyes softened, and she leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm. "That's not what I said. There's always something you can do. But it's not going to be easy. You're going to have to fight for yourself, and that means standing up and making your voice heard. Are you willing to do that? The boy hesitated, his mind racing. He had never been one to make waves, to draw attention to himself. But he also knew that if he didn't do something now, he might never get another chance. He glanced at his father, who gave him a small nod of encouragement. Yes, he said finally, his voice steady. I'll do whatever it takes. Ms. Carter smiled, a glimmer of pride in her eyes. Good. Then let's get to work. For the next hour, Ms. Carter walked the boy through the steps they would need to take to challenge the expulsion. She explained the process of filing an appeal, gathering evidence, and presenting their case to the school board. The boy listened intently, his mind racing as he tried to absorb everything she was saying. It was overwhelming, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he had a fighting chance. As they left the community center, the boy couldn't help but feel a sense of hope. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, but he also knew he wasn't alone. With his father and Ms. Carter by his side, he felt like he could face whatever challenges lay ahead. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. The boy spent hours with Ms. Carter, preparing for the appeal. They gathered statements from classmates who had witnessed the incident, reviewed school policies, and even practiced how he would present his case to the school board. It was exhausting, but the boy was determined. For the first time in his life, he felt like he was taking control of his own future. His father was there every step of the way, offering quiet support and encouragement. He didn't say much, but his presence was enough to remind the boy that he wasn't alone in this fight. Together, they worked late into the night, going over every detail until the boy felt confident in his ability to stand up for himself. Finally, the day of the appeal arrived. The boy woke up early, his stomach churning with nerves. He dressed carefully, choosing a button-up shirt and slacks to make a good impression. His father drove him to the school, the tension in the car palpable. Neither of them spoke much, but the boy could feel his father's silent reassurance. When they arrived, they were met by Ms. Carter, who was waiting for them outside the school board meeting room. She gave the boy a reassuring smile and handed him a folder filled with the documents they had prepared. "You've got this," she said firmly. "Just remember to stay calm and stick to the facts." The boy nodded, his throat too tight to speak. He followed her into the room, his heart pounding in his chest. The school board members were already seated at a long table, their expressions serious as they reviewed the documents in front of them. The principal and the teacher who had expelled him were also there, sitting on the opposite side of the room. The boy took a deep breath and stepped forward, his hands trembling slightly as he placed the folder on the table. He glanced at his father, who gave him a small nod of encouragement, and then at Ms. Carter, who smiled reassuringly. With a deep breath, he began to speak. "My name is," boy's name, he said, his voice steady despite the nerves. "I'm here today to appeal my expulsion and to explain what really happened." For the next few minutes, the boy laid out his case, sticking to the facts as Ms. Carter had advised. He explained the incident in class, the argument with the other student, and the teacher's reaction. He presented the statements from his classmates, highlighting the fact that he had not been the instigator. He even pointed out inconsistencies in the school's policies, showing that the punishment did not fit the offense. As he spoke, he could see the school board members listening intently, their expressions thoughtful. The principal and the teacher remained silent, their faces unreadable. When he finished, the room was quiet for a moment, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Finally, one of the board members spoke. "Thank you for your presentation," she said. "We'll take this under advisement and let you know our decision." The boy nodded, his heart still racing as he stepped back from the table. He had done everything he could, and now all he could do was wait. The wait for the school board's decision felt like an eternity. The boy spent the next few days at home, trying to distract himself with books and chores, but his mind kept drifting back to the appeal. He replayed his presentation over and over in his head, wondering if he had said enough, if he had been convincing enough. His father tried to keep him busy, but even he seemed tense, his usual calm demeanor replaced by a quiet unease. Finally, the call came. It was Ms. Carter, her voice calm but urgent. "The school board has reached a decision," she said. "We need to meet at the school tomorrow morning." The boy's heart raced as he hung up the phone. He didn't know what to expect, but he knew that whatever the decision was, it would change everything. That night, he barely slept, his mind filled with a mix of hope and fear. The next morning, he dressed carefully once again, his hands trembling as he buttoned his shirt. His father drove him to the school in silence, the tension in the car almost unbearable. When they arrived, Miss Carter was waiting for them outside the school board meeting room, her expression unreadable. "Are you ready?" she asked, her voice gentle but firm. The boy nodded, his throat too tight to speak. He followed her into the room, his heart pounding in his chest. The school board members were already seated, their expressions serious as they reviewed the documents in front of them. The principal and the teacher were also there, their faces unreadable. The boy took a deep breath and stepped forward, his hands clenched at his sides. He glanced at his father, who gave him a small nod of encouragement, and then at Ms. Carter, who smiled reassuringly. With a deep breath, he prepared himself for whatever was coming. The chairman of the school board stood up, his expression solemn. "After careful consideration of the evidence presented, we have reached a decision," he said, his voice echoing in the quiet room. "We have decided to overturn the expulsion and reinstate boy's name as a student at this school." The boy's heart skipped a beat, his mind struggling to process the words. He had won. They had listened to him. He felt a surge of relief and gratitude, his eyes filling with tears as he glanced at his father and Miss Carter. But the chairman wasn't finished. However, he continued, his tone serious, "This incident has highlighted some serious issues that need to be addressed. We will be conducting a full review of the school's disciplinary policies and procedures to ensure that all students are treated fairly and equitably." The boy nodded, his chest swelling with a mix of pride and hope. He had not only fought for himself but had also sparked a change that could benefit others. As he left the room, he felt a sense of accomplishment that he had never felt before. But as he stepped out into the hallway, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The fight for fairness and equality was far from over, and he knew that he had a role to play in it. With his father and Ms. Carter by his side, he felt ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The days following the school board's decision were a mix of relief and adjustment. The boy returned to school, but things were different now. The teachers treated him with a newfound caution, and some of his classmates looked at him with curiosity, as if trying to figure out what had really happened. He could feel the weight of their stares, but he tried to ignore it, focusing instead on catching up on the work he had missed. His father, too, seemed different. There was a quiet pride in his eyes, a sense of satisfaction that he didn't need to put into words. He didn't say much, but his actions spoke volumes. He made sure the boy had everything he needed, from school supplies to a quiet place to study. He even started attending parent-teacher meetings, something he had rarely done before. Ms. Carter continued to be a source of support, checking in regularly to see how the boy was doing. She also kept him updated on the school board's review of the disciplinary policies, which was progressing slowly but steadily. The boy felt a sense of pride knowing that his case had sparked this change, but he also knew that there was still a long way to go. One afternoon, as the boy was walking home from school, he ran into the student who had been involved in the argument that led to his expulsion. The other boy looked nervous, his eyes darting around as if unsure of what to say. The boy hesitated for a moment, then decided to break the ice. "Hey," he said, his voice calm but firm. The other boy looked up, surprised. "Hey," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. There was an awkward silence for a moment, then the boy took a deep breath. Look, I don't know what happened between us, but I don't want there to be any hard feelings. We're both here to learn, and I think we can do that better if we're not fighting. The other boy nodded, his expression softening. Yeah, I guess you're right. I'm sorry about what happened. I didn't mean for it to go that far. The boy smiled, a sense of relief washing over him. It's okay. Let's just move on, all right? The other boy nodded again, a small smile playing on his lips. All right. As they walked away, the boy felt a sense of closure. He knew that not every conflict could be resolved so easily, but this was a start. He had stood up for himself, and in doing so, he had also found a way to bridge the gap between himself and others. When he got home, his father was waiting for him, a rare smile on his face. How was school? He asked, his voice casual but his eyes filled with curiosity. The boy shrugged, a small smile playing on his lips. It was good. I think things are finally starting to settle down. His father nodded, a sense of satisfaction in his eyes. Good. I'm proud of you, you know that? The boy felt a surge of warmth, his chest swelling with pride. Thanks, Dad. I couldn't have done it without you. His father smiled, a rare but genuine expression of happiness. You're stronger than you think. Just remember that. As the boy went to his room to start his homework, he couldn't help but feel a sense of hope. He had faced a difficult situation and come out stronger on the other side. And with his father and Ms. Carter by his side, he knew he could face whatever challenges lay ahead. Life began to settle into a new rhythm for the boy. The initial buzz around his return to school faded, and things started to feel normal again, or as normal as they could be after everything that had happened. He focused on his studies, determined to make up for the time he had lost. His teachers, though still cautious around him, began to treat him like any other student, and his classmates slowly stopped staring. It felt like the storm had passed, but the boy knew better. He knew that the changes he had sparked were still unfolding, and he couldn't afford to let his guard down completely. One afternoon, Ms. Carter called him into her office at the community center. She had been working closely with the school board to review the disciplinary policies, and she wanted to update him on their progress. The boy arrived to find her sitting at her desk, a stack of papers in front of her and a determined look on her face. We're making progress, she said as soon as he walked in. The school board has agreed to implement some changes based on your case. They're going to introduce a new system for handling conflicts between students, one that focuses on mediation and understanding rather than punishment. The boy listened intently, a sense of pride swelling in his chest. It felt good to know that his experience had led to something positive, something that could help other students avoid going through what he had. But there's more, Miss Carter continued, her expression serious. They've also agreed to hold workshops for teachers and staff on implicit bias and cultural sensitivity. It's a step in the right direction, but it's just the beginning. There's still a lot of work to be done. The boy nodded, his mind racing. He had never thought of himself as someone who could make a difference, but now he was starting to see that he had the power to create change. It was a daunting responsibility, but it was also empowering. I want you to be part of this, Ms. Carter said, her eyes locking onto his. You've already shown that you have the courage to stand up for what's right. Now it's time to take that a step further. I want you to join the student advisory committee that's being formed to help implement these changes. Your voice matters, and I think you have a lot to contribute. The boy hesitated, unsure if he was ready for such a responsibility. But then he thought about everything he had been through, everything he had fought for. He had come this far, and he wasn't about to back down now. Okay, he said finally, his voice steady. I'll do it. Ms. Carter smiled, a glimmer of pride in her eyes. Good. I knew you would. Over the next few weeks, the boy threw himself into his new role on the student advisory committee. He attended meetings, shared his experiences, and worked with other students to come up with ideas for making the school a better place. It wasn't always easy, there were disagreements and setbacks, but he was determined to see it through. His father, too, continued to support him, though in his own quiet way. He didn't say much, but the boy could see the pride in his eyes whenever he talked about the committee or the changes they were working on. It was a silent but powerful reminder that he wasn't alone in this. One evening, as the boy was working on a proposal for the committee, his father walked into the room and sat down across from him. For a moment, they sat in silence, the only sound the scratching of the boy's pen on paper. Then his father spoke, his voice low and thoughtful. "You've come a long way," he said. "I'm proud of you." The boy looked up, surprised. His father wasn't one to express his feelings often, and the words caught him off guard. "Thanks, Dad," he said quietly. "I couldn't have done it without you." His father nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. "You're stronger than you think. Just remember that." As the boy went back to his work, he couldn't help but feel a sense of hope. He had faced a difficult situation and come out stronger on the other side. And now, he was using that strength to make a difference, not just for himself, but for others as well. It was a daunting responsibility, but it was also empowering. And with his father and Ms. Carter by his side, he knew he could face whatever challenges lay ahead. The Student Advisory Committee's work was gaining momentum. The boy, along with a small group of dedicated students, had become a driving force behind the changes being implemented at the school. They met regularly, brainstorming ideas, drafting proposals, and presenting them to the school board. It was hard work, but the boy found it fulfilling. For the first time in his life, he felt like he was part of something bigger than himself. One of their biggest achievements was the introduction of a peer mediation program. The idea was simple but powerful. Instead of immediately resorting to punishment, students involved in conflicts would sit down with trained peer mediators to talk through their issues and find a resolution. The boy had been instrumental in pushing for this program, drawing on his own experience to highlight the importance of understanding and communication. The program was launched with a series of workshops, where students and teachers alike were trained in conflict resolution techniques. The boy attended every session, his determination unwavering. He even volunteered to be one of the first peer mediators, using his own story to help others navigate their conflicts. But not everyone was on board with the changes. Some teachers were resistant, clinging to the old ways of doing things. The boy could sense their skepticism, and it frustrated him. He had worked so hard to make these changes happen, and he didn't want to see them fail. One day, after a particularly tense meeting with a group of teachers, the boy found himself feeling discouraged. He had tried to explain the benefits of the peer mediation program, but it felt like his words were falling on deaf ears. As he walked home, his mind was racing, trying to figure out how to get through to them. When he got home, his father was waiting for him, as usual. He could tell something was wrong just by the look on his son's face. "Rough day?" he asked, his voice calm but concerned. The boy nodded, sinking into a chair. "Some of the teachers just don't get it," he said, his voice heavy with frustration. "They don't see why these changes are important. It's like they're stuck in the past." His father listened quietly, his expression thoughtful. "Change is hard," he said finally. "People don't like to let go of the way things have always been, even if it's not working. But that doesn't mean you give up. You just have to find a way to show them why it matters." The boy sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I'm trying, Dad. But it's not easy." His father nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. "Nothing worth doing ever is. But you've already come so far. Don't let a few setbacks stop you now." The boy thought about his father's words long after their conversation had ended. He knew his father was right, but it didn't make the situation any less frustrating. Still, he was determined to keep pushing forward. He had come too far to give up now. The next day, he went back to school with a renewed sense of purpose. He sought out the teachers who had been resistant and asked if he could sit down with them to discuss their concerns. To his surprise, most of them agreed. Over the next few weeks, he had a series of one-on-one conversations with them, patiently explaining the benefits of the peer mediation program and addressing their concerns. It wasn't easy, and there were still some who remained skeptical, but slowly, he began to see a shift. Some of the teachers started to come around, expressing their support for the program and even volunteering to help with the workshops. It was a small victory, but it gave the boy hope. As the weeks turned into months, the changes at the school became more visible. The peer mediation program was a success, with fewer conflicts escalating into disciplinary actions. The workshops on implicit bias and cultural sensitivity were well attended, and the school board was already talking about expanding the program to other schools in the district. The boy couldn't help but feel a sense of pride as he walked through the halls of his school. He had faced a difficult situation and come out stronger on the other side. And now, he was using that strength to make a difference, not just for himself, but for others as well. It was a daunting responsibility, but it was also empowering. And with his father and Ms. Carter by his side, he knew he could face whatever challenges lay ahead. The school year was coming to an end, and the boy couldn't believe how much had changed in such a short time. What had started as a personal struggle had turned into a movement, one that was reshaping the way his school handled conflicts and discipline. The peer mediation program was thriving, and the workshops on implicit bias and cultural sensitivity had become a regular part of the school's curriculum. The boy had even been invited to speak at a district-wide conference, where he shared his story and the lessons he had learned. As he stood on the stage, looking out at the sea of faces, he felt a sense of pride and accomplishment. He had come a long way from the scared and frustrated student who had been expelled just a few months ago. Now, he was a leader, someone who others looked up to and respected. But even as he basked in the success of his efforts, the boy knew that his work was far from over. There were still challenges to face, still changes to be made. And he was determined to see it through. One of the biggest challenges was ensuring that the changes they had implemented would last. The boy knew that it was easy to get caught up in the excitement of something new, but maintaining momentum over the long term was a different story. He worked closely with Ms. Carter and the Student Advisory Committee to develop a plan for sustaining the program, including regular check-ins and updates to keep everyone engaged. Another challenge was expanding the program to other schools in the district. The boy had been approached by several students and teachers from neighboring schools who were interested in implementing similar programs. He was excited by the opportunity to make a difference on a larger scale, but he also knew that it would require a lot of work and coordination. Despite the challenges, the boy felt a sense of hope and determination. He had faced difficult situations before and come out stronger on the other side. And now, he had a team of dedicated individuals by his side, all working toward the same goal. As the school year came to a close, the boy reflected on everything he had been through. He had started the year feeling powerless and frustrated, but he had ended it feeling empowered and hopeful. He had learned that change was possible, but it required courage, determination, and a willingness to stand up for what was right. On the last day of school, the boy stood in the hallway, watching as students and teachers said their goodbyes and headed off for the summer. He felt a sense of pride and accomplishment, knowing that he had played a part in making the school a better place. As he walked out of the building, his father was waiting for him, a rare smile on his face. "Proud of you, son," he said, his voice filled with emotion. The boy smiled back, feeling a surge of warmth. "Thanks, Dad. I couldn't have done it without you." His father nodded, a sense of satisfaction in his eyes. "You're stronger than you think. Just remember that." As they drove home, the boy couldn't help but feel a sense of hope for the future. He had faced a difficult situation and come out stronger on the other side. And now, he was using that strength to make a difference, not just for himself, but for others as well. It was a daunting responsibility, but it was also empowering. And with his father and Ms. Carter by his side, he knew he could face whatever challenges lay ahead. The boy knew that the road ahead would not be easy, but he was ready for it. He had learned that change was possible, but it required courage, determination, and a willingness to stand up for what was right. And he was determined to do just that, no matter what challenges lay ahead.